He's been improving so much, but already came to the tour as a full-on player.
He owns the world. He can't own a door. Carlos Alcaraz conquered everything in tennis, yet one house in Murcia still swallows him whole. August 2026. He's finally healed that cruel wrist injury behind him. Cincinnati within reach. Relief everywhere. Then Martina Navratilova said two soft words about him and accidentally exposed something nobody was ready for. Picture the scene. A boy who beat kings walks home, and at that ordinary threshold, the champion simply vanishes. He refuses to enter his parents' house as the man millions worship. Rewind to April. Seconds after his glorious crown, one careless photo escaped his living room. Fans zoomed into a shoebox space, a bedroom smaller than a locker. Their hearts sank. Something felt heartbreakingly off. Reporters started digging, and the pattern hurt more than it shocked. Why would the greatest young player alive shrink the instant he steps inside? Navratilova kept praising his humility, never sensing the ache underneath. No scandal hides here, just something tender enough to break you. Before we open that door, smash subscribe and ring the bell so no tennis story this raw ever slips past you. Here's the room Carlos Alcaraz won't walk into as champion. The doorway itself is where the whole story lives, so let us step through it slowly. Alcaraz walks toward that entrance carrying a resume that already belongs in tennis history books. Somewhere between the gate and the tile, though, a transformation takes hold. The world number one dissolves. What actually crosses the threshold is a young man from El Palmar who still answers to his mother, still gets questioned about staying out too late, still absorbs a scolding when he forgets the small responsibilities everyone else in the family manages without applause. Navratilova spent years describing that exact transformation without ever labeling it a secret. She admired it. She never realized she was decoding it. To understand the size of what he sets aside at that mat, you have to grasp who he is on the other side of it. This is a player who reached the summit of the men's game at 19, becoming the youngest man ever to hold the world number one ranking. Juan Carlos Ferrero, a former French Open champion and world number one himself, shaped that ascent from the practice courts of Villena. Under that guidance, the teenager from Murcia turned raw power into a complete arsenal. The kind of game Navratilova once described as scarier than anything she had witnessed. By his early 20s, he had already collected multiple Grand Slam crowns and built a rivalry with Jannik Sinner that now defines the sport. On the court, he is a force reshaping tennis. Inside his family home, none of that carries the slightest weight. The address that houses this contradiction sits in the same modest neighborhood where he learned the game. His father ran the local tennis club, and the boy grew up hitting balls against familiar walls long before the world knew his name. Nothing about the property signals that a global champion sleeps there. When the photograph leaked this past April, mere days after he stood on stage to accept the Laureus World Sportsman of the Year award, the contrast detonated across social media. Viewers scanning the image searched for the mansion, the marble, the sweeping terrace overlooking the coast. They found instead a snug living room, a television screen far smaller than the ones hanging in ordinary suburban homes, and a bedroom that would struggle to fit a king-sized bed. The reaction ranged from disbelief to outright suspicion. Surely a decoy, people muttered. Surely a stunt. Alcaraz met the frenzy with a calm that unsettled the doubters even further. He had not staged the shot to send a message about humility. He had simply been lounging on the sofa, watching Spain compete in the Davis Cup, exactly as any 22-year-old would on a rare afternoon off. The virality mildly embarrassed him, though nothing about the modesty behind it did. That room, he explained, pulls him back toward his origins. Within those walls, he stops functioning as a headline and reverts to the little Carlitos who once dreamed with a racket far too big for his hands. Peace was the word he reached for. And for someone whose every gesture gets photographed the instant he leaves a locker room, peace is not indulgence, it is oxygen. The rule governing that front door is what elevates the whole situation from charming to genuinely remarkable. Across several interviews, Alcaraz has stated the principle without flinching. The second his feet touch the floor inside, his parents' authority overrides everything. 2 Grand Slams or 15, the count changes nothing. They set the terms beneath that roof, and he describes that arrangement as beautiful rather than restrictive. Sit with the implication for a moment. One of the most talented athletes his sport has ever produced, a competitor who has toppled Novak Djokovic on the grandest occasions, voluntarily surrenders every shred of status the instant he arrives at the place that raised him. The crown gets left on the mat, household duties, gentle curfews, and the occasional dressing down take its place. Those curfews are no exaggeration. His parents no longer impose a rigid hour on a grown man, yet they still remind him not to stay out too late, still expect him to fulfill his obligations, still make their disappointment known when he falls short, ignore their guidance and they will tell him off, and he takes the correction without protest. The #1 ranking buys him no privileges at that dinner table. To his mother and father he registers not as a superstar, but as their child, and children abide by the rhythms of the household. That is the precise reason the champion cannot walk inside. The champion would expect to be treated as special. The son understands, deep in his bones, that expecting anything of the sort would betray everything his family taught him. Viewed that way, the door behaves less like a wall and more like a sieve. It removes the persona the public fixates on and hands back the version his family cherishes. And that mechanism sharpens the harder question lurking beneath the whole affair. Why would a man wealthy enough to purchase an entire street cling so stubbornly to a cramped house in Murcia? Money has never tempted him out. Pressed directly on whether he intended to buy a place of his own, his answer arrived instantly and free of any hidden ambition. Not at the moment, he said, adding that living beside his parents and siblings genuinely makes him happy. Prize checks accumulate season after season. His mailing address refuses to budge. His older brother Alvaro already moved out, which makes Carlos the deliberate holdout, rather than a young man who simply never got around to leaving. The reasoning he offered exposes more than he likely meant to reveal. Because the punishing tennis calendar keeps him traveling for the overwhelming majority of the year, the scarce weeks at home become treasures, and he would far rather spend them enveloped by family than echoing around some cavernous mansion. His mother misses him during those endless absences and still wants him beneath her roof. That gravitational pull exerted by a parent unwilling to release her son and a son unwilling to drift away keeps him tethered to a place most of his peers would have abandoned the moment their first major payday cleared. The family he shelters behind that door illuminates the depth of his loyalty. His father, Carlos Alcaraz Gonzalez, guided his earliest development through the local club and remains a steadying presence in his corner. Alvaro travels alongside him as a hitting partner, one reassuring face amid the anonymous crowds of the tour. His mother, Virginia Garcia Escandon, rarely appears in the player's box at the biggest tournaments, and the explanation carries tenderness rather than tension. She stays behind to raise his younger brothers, Sergio and Jaime, the youngest already showing real promise on a court himself. Alcaraz has spoken openly about the sting of being separated from them during long stretches abroad. As the weeks away accumulate, the realization of how much he depends on them only grows sharper. Returning home is not an obligation he tolerates. It is a relief he craves. One small detail warms the entire portrait. A meaningful slice of what draws him back is his mother's cooking. After endless hotel buffets and restaurant menus in unfamiliar cities, a home-cooked plate at her table means more to him than any lavish celebration in Ibiza or a glittering night out in New York. He has chosen quiet evenings in El Palmar over glamorous escapes time and again, presenting the simplest routines as the actual reward rather than a compromise. While much of the tour unwinds through luxury and spectacle, he decompresses through ordinariness. That appetite for the plain and the familiar is the emotional engine driving everything, and it is exactly what the door safeguards each time he declines to carry his fame across the threshold. Strip back one more layer and you uncover the single act of defiance that confirms this is a living relationship rather than a flawless performance of obedience. Alcaraz commemorates each maiden Grand Slam triumph with a tattoo, a private ritual his parents have never embraced. To ease their worries in the beginning, he promised the ink would stop at the first title in each major. That promise has quietly cracked. Following his second US Open crown, he added the Statue of Liberty and the Brooklyn Bridge to his skin, sailing well past the borders of the original agreement. His parents fret that the collection will keep spreading until his body disappears beneath it. He reassures them with the composure of a seasoned negotiator, noting that the designs stay small, tucked into discreet corners, never sprawling across his face or anywhere impossible to hide. Everything remains under control, he insists. That friction matters enormously because it demolishes any temptation to read him as a saintly automaton. He argues. He bends his word. He defends his choices exactly as any young adult does, with parents who still hold genuine sway over the household. Even his rebellion, though, arrives wrapped in respect. He discusses the tattoos openly rather than concealing them, pursues a negotiated peace rather than open warfare, and keeps the ink modest partly out of consideration for their comfort. Among those earliest tattoos sits his grandfather's motto, 3 letters standing for head, heart, and a saltier Spanish word for courage. He carries his family's wisdom permanently on his forearm. Rebellion and reverence coexist within the same young man, and that coexistence is precisely what makes the bond feel authentic instead of manufactured for a documentary. Here is where Navratilova walks back into the picture and where the title collects on every promise it made. She has observed this player since his teenage years, back when he first began stunning the establishment. On one occasion, she predicted he could evolve into a more powerful version of Djokovic, a possibility she admitted was frankly frightening. She praised the way he summons his sharpest tennis precisely when the pressure peaks. Through all of that analysis, she kept returning to a single quality that outranked his forehand or his footwork in her estimation: the humility, the steadfast refusal to let stardom rewrite his identity. She intended it as praise about character. Read alongside everything unfolding at that Murcia doorway, the compliment quietly transforms into the explanation. The very humility she keeps applauding is the force that compels him to leave the champion standing outside. This is the revelation hiding in the open, visible to anyone willing to connect the pieces. Navratilova never scheduled a moment to spill a confidential truth. She merely kept describing, year after year across countless broadcasts and interviews, a man who treats his own greatness as something to lay aside rather than parade. When a figure of her stature repeatedly gestures toward his grounded nature, she is unknowingly narrating the reason he cannot march through his parents' front door wearing the ranking like a badge. The trophies would trail him inside, the ego would trail the trophies. Both meet their end at the mat because the boy his family raised was never permitted to imagine himself larger than the household. Her admiration and his behavior form 2 halves of an identical truth, and only when the halves are laid side by side does the full shape emerge. The current year subjected that truth to its cruelest examination. A wrist injury tore through his 2026 campaign, forcing him out for months and consuming the grass court stretch he had come to own. For a competitor built on momentum, rhythm, and sheer joy, the layoff was brutal in a way statistics fail to capture. And where did he retreat to mend? Not to a clinic in some fashionable metropolis, not to a sterile training compound sealed away from everyone he loves. He returned through that same door, back into the small rooms, the familiar routines, and his mother's kitchen. The place that strips away his fame doubles as the place that rebuilds him when his body betrays him. Navratilova followed his recovery attentively, exchanging thoughts with Boris Becker, and when reports as finally indicated the wrist had healed, she responded with a brief burst of relief and a trio of crossed finger emojis. "Great news," she wrote, an entire sport exhaled beside her. By this August, the darkest chapter had lifted, and Cincinnati appeared on the horizon as the likely stage for his comeback. The injury saga, rather than distracting from the deeper point, quietly reinforced it. Take away the thing that defines a champion, the court, the ranking, the electric rivalry with Sinner, and what survives is a young man who leans on his family more heavily than he leans on his fame. The door that turns the world number 1 away swings open for the recovering son without a second's hesitation. During the lowest professional stretch of his life so far, that ordinary house expanded to fill his entire world, precisely because it had never once treated him as extraordinary. The modesty that baffled the internet in April turned out to be the safety net waiting to catch him when everything else gave way. Examine his tennis closely and you spot the household's fingerprints all over it. That grandfather's motto etched into his arm surfaces in the moments that settle finals. The head holding steady, the heart refusing surrender, the nerves staying firm while lesser players crumble. The humility Navratilova admires keeps him hungry instead of complacent, forever cast as the underdog in his own imagination, regardless of how many titles accumulate. The peace he discovers behind the door allows him to walk back onto the court unburdened, released from the relentless exposure he has described as one of the harder costs of his life. Every thread traces back to a single origin. His refusal to enter as champion is no eccentric quirk. It functions as the quiet architecture holding his entire career upright, and removing it would collapse the very quality that makes him great. Set him against the archetype the sport usually manufactures, and the choice starts to look almost rebellious in its own right. Superstars typically bolt from their beginnings the instant success materializes, swapping cramped childhood bedrooms for gated estates and status symbols engineered to broadcast the distance they have traveled. Alcaraz sprints the opposite way. He guards his origins rather than erasing them. Commentators have compared his humility to Rafael Nadal's, another Spaniard who never allowed staggering fame to dislodge his sense of self. Yet even within that proud lineage, the image of a reigning #1 performing bicep curls inside a tiny room he has slept in since boyhood delivers its own quiet jolt. Any life imaginable sits within his reach. He keeps selecting the smallest one available, so the title was never a deception, merely a lens polished for effect. He genuinely refuses to enter his parents' house, in the only sense that truly counts. Walking in as the man the world worships is off the table. Dragging his ranking and his aura past the doorframe is unthinkable to him. Allowing the champion to contaminate the sanctuary that keeps him human would defeat the whole purpose of coming home. Navratilova exposed the reason without ever meaning to, one admiring observation at a time, because the humility she keeps celebrating is the exact key that locks his stardom outside. No scandal festers beneath the surface. Something rarer and far more moving waits there instead. A young man perched at the peak of his sport who understood, early and completely, that the person he becomes at home deserves protection from the legend he becomes on court. Consider how easily the alternative could have unfolded. A different champion, handed the same gifts and the same fortune, might have let the applause seep into every corner of his life until the private man and the public icon became indistinguishable. Fame has hollowed out plenty of prodigies who lost the ability to switch it off. Alcaraz built himself a hard boundary and defended it, not with security gates or publicists, but with a doorway and a set of unspoken family rules. The genius of it is that the boundary costs him nothing he values and preserves everything he does. He walks out to face the exposure, the pressure, and the rivalry, then walks back to shed all of it at the mat. That rhythm, out into the storm and home into the calm, may explain the longevity most observers expect from him more than any technical adjustment Ferrero ever installed. There's also something worth noting about how his family reacts to all of this attention on their modest life. They have not rushed to upgrade the house to satisfy strangers on the internet, nor scrambled to project an image more befitting a global brand. The living room stayed exactly as it was, the rules held firm. That steadiness, radiating from parents who refuse to be dazzled by their son's celebrity, is itself the source of the phenomenon. A young man raised by people impressed with trophies would learn to expect a hero's welcome at his own front door. A young man raised by people who simply want their son home for dinner learns instead to leave the trophies in the car. The door only works because the family behind it never stopped treating him as ordinary, and he never stopped wanting them to. That, in the end, is the answer the thumbnail dangled and the answer the sources actually support. A shoebox living room in Murcia. A curfew that quietly outranks a grand slam. A mother who still saves a plate for her traveling son. A grandfather's three-letter creed inked permanently into a champion's arm. And a young man wise enough, humble enough, and loved enough to leave his crown on the mat every single time he comes home. Navratilova handed us the explanation without knowing it, hidden inside years of praise for the one trait that governs his whole existence. The reveal was never ugly. It was tender all along. If this deeper portrait of Carlos Alcaraz moved you, if you crave the tennis stories other channels are too lazy or too rushed to chase properly, now is the moment to act. Tap that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and leave a comment telling us whether his choice to stay grounded makes him the most refreshing superstar the game has produced in years. Share this with the tennis fan in your life who still believes greatness and humility cannot share the same address. And stick around, because the next revelation is already loading, and what we uncover next about the sport's brightest names may surprise you, Evids.